The winter morning began before the light itself. The air was so cold that every breath turned to frost and lingered in front of the face like smoke. Across the wide, frozen field, the snow stretched smooth and untouched, a white plain beneath the dim sky. There was no wind at first, no sound, only the distant creak of the trees as the frost deepened in their bark. Somewhere far off, an owl finished its night cry and fell silent. Then, from the line of birch trees on the northern edge of the field, a shape appeared, a moose, tall and dark, moving with slow, heavy grace through the pale light. His body steamed faintly, the warmth of his life rising against the brutal stillness of winter. Each step pressed into the crusted snow with a soft, cracking sound. The moose paused often, listening. His ears twitched at every whisper of air, every distant crack. He was alone, and yet something made him hesitate, as if another presence waited beyond sight. He lowered his head, brushed the icy ground with his muzzle, and kept walking toward the open field. Behind him, the wind rose for a moment, erasing the prints he had made. In the small village on the other side of the field, a man named Andre stood by the window of his wooden house. The frost had drawn white veins across the glass, but through the small, clear circle he had wiped with his hand, he could see the dim line of the birches. He had not gone hunting in years. The rifle hung above the door, clean but unused, a relic of another life. The fields used to be full of movement then, rabbits, elk, wolves, but now there was only silence. His wife had passed away 2 winters ago, and his grown son had left for the city. The house, once filled with voices, now creaked like an empty hull in the wind. Andre poured hot tea into a chipped enamel cup and drank without tasting it. Outside, the day was beginning to pale, the horizon a faint silver. He felt that same pull again, the one that always came when the world grew too still. It was not quite curiosity, not quite loneliness, but something deeper, a need to step into that quiet space and see what waited there. He dressed slowly, pulling on thick wool socks, a heavy coat, fur gloves. He took his binoculars from the shelf, checked their lenses, and tucked them under his arm. When he opened the door, the cold hit him like water. The snow squeaked sharply under his boots, the sound echoing off the wooden walls. He walked down the narrow path between the fences, past the frozen well and the row of silent houses, each one shuttered and asleep. Beyond the last yard, the world opened wide. The frozen fields stretched before him, untouched, shining faintly in the growing light. He stopped for a moment to listen. The air was alive with a thin, constant whisper, the kind that only comes when the temperature drops below breath. He heard the faint tapping of a branch somewhere, the shifting of ice in a distant creek. And then, far out, near the line of birches, something moved. A shadow, large and deliberate. He raised his binoculars, the lenses fogging from his breath, and through the mist he saw it. The moose, stepping carefully across the open snow, its body half lost in the pale glare of morning. The animal was magnificent, immense yet silent, its coat dark against the white world. Andre watched it for a long time, his heart beating slow and steady. It had been years since he had seen one so close. The moose lifted its head, and for a moment it seemed to look directly at him. Their eyes met across the frozen distance. There was no fear in the animal's gaze, only calm acknowledgement, as if it understood something that Andre did not. Then it turned and continued on its way, moving slowly toward the far end of the field. Andre lowered the binoculars. For a long while he simply stood there, letting the cold sink through his coat, his breath rising in slow clouds. The world felt heavy with meaning, though he could not say what that meaning was. It was just a moose crossing the field, but something about it felt ancient, solemn, like a memory rising from beneath the snow. He took a step forward and then another, drawn toward the place where the moose had walked. The wind began to pick up again, carrying fine particles of frost that sparkled in the pale sun. And when he finally reached the spot, he saw that the prints the moose had left were already gone. The snow was smooth again, untouched, as if nothing had passed through at all. By the time the sun rose fully, a weak, pale disk behind a sheet of cloud, Andre was already halfway across the frozen field. The light spread without warmth, coloring the snow in shades of gray and silver. His breath came heavy, the cold biting at his nostrils, his eyelashes stiff with frost. He carried no weapon, only the binoculars hanging around his neck and the quiet urge that had driven him out of the village before dawn. Somewhere ahead, beyond the ripple of birch trees, he hoped to find the trail, the path of the moose he had seen moving like a shadow through the morning. He found it soon enough. The first tracks appeared near a small dip in the snow, where the wind had gathered drifts against a fallen fence. They were clear and deep, spaced wide apart, broad hoof prints, pressed into the surface like dark mirrors. The moose had crossed here, no doubt. Andre crouched, touched one with his gloved hand, and felt the frozen edge crumble slightly under his fingers. He smiled, a quiet, instinctive response from years of hunting. The animal was large, healthy, and had passed not long ago. The cold preserved the tracks perfectly, at least for now. He followed them. His boots sank with a muffled crunch as he walked, the field stretching endless and empty around him. The prince moved in a straight line toward the trees, steady and patient. But the wind had begun to rise again. It came in slow gusts that carried fine dust of snow, filling the hollows, softening the sharp edges of the trail. After a few hundred meters, the tracks became faint, then scattered, and finally, gone. The snow ahead was smooth, unbroken, untouched by any living thing. Andre stopped, confused. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the white expanse. It was impossible. A moose didn't just vanish. He walked forward several paces, then to the side, searching for any sign, broken crust, a shadow of indentation. But there was nothing. The surface gleamed like glass, as if the field itself had erased the passage. He knelt again, resting his hand on the snow. The cold bit through the glove immediately. Beneath his palm, the crust felt hard, glazed by the wind. Not a mark, not a trace. He straightened and raised the binoculars. The horizon shimmered with heatless light, the trees dark against the sky. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, far off near the edge of the forest, a shape appeared, tall, motionless, watching. The moose stood there, half shadow, half solid, its breath faintly visible in the distance. Andre's chest tightened. He focused the lenses until the outline sharpened. The animal faced him directly, massive and silent, its dark eyes fixed on the man standing alone in the field. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The wind passed between them, carrying snow like smoke. Then, just as Andre lowered the binoculars to call out, though he didn't know what he would have said, the wind rose sharply, lifting a curtain of frost between them. When it cleared, the moose was gone. He waited, scanning the tree line again, but the animal had disappeared as completely as its tracks. All that remained was the endless, empty field. The only sound was the soft whisper of snow grains brushing against his coat. Andre turned slowly toward the village. For a moment he considered walking on, deeper into the forest, to find where the animal had gone. But something held him still. A strange hesitation, like standing at the edge of a memory. He looked once more at the place where the prince had vanished, then back toward the dark outline of the woods. When he finally began to walk home, the wind was at his back, smoothing over the shallow prints of his own boots. By the time he reached the birches, even those were fading. He looked behind him once and saw only a field of white, flat, silent, and whole again, as if neither man nor moose had ever crossed it. That evening, the village was quiet beneath a sky of pale blue ash. Smoke rose straight from the chimneys, thin, brittle lines that broke apart in the cold air. Andre sat in the small store by the stove, warming his hands. The scent of kerosene and dry bread hung in the air. Across the counter, old Lita poured him tea from a dented metal pot. She had known him since he was a boy, back when the winters felt shorter and the forest closer. "You've been out again," she said, not as a question. Her voice had that slow rhythm of someone who had lived too long in the same place. Andre nodded. "I saw a moose this morning." "Out on the field?" Lita smiled without surprise. "Of course you did. He always comes when the frost hardens." Andre frowned. You say that as if it's the same one every year. It is, she said simply, stirring her tea. The same moose, walking the same way through the field. My father saw him when I was a girl. I've seen him many times since. He hesitated. That's not possible. A moose doesn't live that long. Lyda looked up, her eyes bright against the dim light. Then maybe it's not the same moose. Maybe it's the same silence. The stove cracked and the sound filled the pause that followed. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the windows. Andre stared into his cup. The words sounded foolish, yet they lodged in his chest like something he had always known. The silence? Yes, that part he understood. It had followed him since his wife's passing, since his son's departure, since the day he stopped hunting because the weight of life had begun to feel heavier than the pull of the trigger. Lita poured more tea. You know, some say the moose comes to remind us what the land used to be, before the roads, before the noise. Andre gave a short, humorless laugh. You talk like it's a spirit, she shrugged. Maybe it is. Or maybe it's just an animal that knows where it belongs. When he left the shop, night was already falling. The village lamps flickered one by one, casting weak halos onto the snow. Andre walked slowly, his boots crunching softly. The air smelled of pine smoke and iron. He looked across the field again, that wide, frozen space that had swallowed the moose's tracks. The moon was rising now, thin and sharp, shining on the snow like metal. He stood there a long time, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the field breathe under the wind. He imagined the moose somewhere out there in the darkness, moving without sound, following paths older than any fence or road. That night, sleep came fitfully. In his dreams, Andre was walking again through the same frozen plain. The snow glowed faintly under a colorless sky. He felt no cold, no sound of his own steps. When he turned around, there were no tracks behind him, only the smooth, unbroken surface stretching endlessly to the horizon. He called out into the stillness, but his voice did not echo. The air swallowed it whole, as if the world itself refused to remember. He woke before dawn, the room dim, the fire long dead. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The dream and the waking world had blurred together. Outside, a faint wind moved through the birches. The field waited, silent and white. Andre lay back on his pillow and listened, his eyes open to the darkness. He had the strange feeling that something in the world had shifted, though nothing had changed at all. At first light, the frost on the window shone like a thin crust of salt. Andre dressed without hurry, though he already knew he would go. There was no plan, no reason left to invent one, only a quiet insistence that he must follow where the moose had gone. He took nothing with him but the binoculars and a small flask of tea, stepping into the morning cold before the village had begun to stir. The snow was deeper that day, the sky low and heavy. The air carried a faint scent of resin from the birch line ahead. As Andre crossed the open field, his breath came slower, his legs heavy. He followed the faintest impressions in the snow, mere shadows of where the animal had passed before the wind had taken everything else. The marks led him toward the forest, the dark band that seemed to close off the horizon. When he reached the trees, the silence deepened. The air felt different there, thicker, as though sound itself had frozen. He paused, listening to the crack of his own breath. Frost hung on the branches in long silver strands. The forest floor was layered with untouched snow, soft and unbroken. No birds called, no twigs snapped underfoot except his own. He walked deeper. The birches thinned into spruce and pine, their trunks black against the light. A path formed itself, narrow and uneven, leading toward a hollow where the land dipped slightly. He found a broken branch there, the clean tear of wood fresh and bright. Nearby, a faint trace in the snow, a patch where the crust had been disturbed. He crouched, brushed it gently with his glove, and caught the faint, musky scent of an animal. The moose had been here, not long ago. Andre straightened slowly, scanning the trees. The forest seemed to breathe, shifting in the wind. Then he saw it. Movement, still and massive at once. In a clearing ahead, half veiled by the thin curtain of snow, stood the moose. Its body was dark against the white ground, steam rising from its nostrils in steady pulses. The antlers caught the dim light, each tine edged with frost, like branches carved from ice. Andre froze. The binoculars hung forgotten around his neck. The distance between them was not more than 50 meters, but he felt as though he stood before something far older than the forest itself. The animal was not afraid. It simply looked at him, eyes calm, dark, patient. He did not move. Neither did it. The air between them was absolute stillness. He felt suddenly small, absurdly human, surrounded by a world that existed perfectly without him. In that moment, he remembered every creature he had ever hunted, every winter he had taken from the land more than he needed. A wave of shame and reverence passed through him in equal measure. He lowered his gaze, unable to hold the animal's steady eyes any longer. The moose shifted slightly, turned its head, and began to walk away. Slow, deliberate steps into the deeper part of the forest. Its hooves pressed down on the snow, but no sound came. When it disappeared among the pines, the stillness closed again, seamless, like water behind a boat after it passes. Andre exhaled, his breath trembling in the cold. He waited, listening, hoping for another sound, another glimpse, but there was nothing. When he finally stepped forward into the clearing, the snow beneath him was untouched. No prints, no sign of passage. Only the faint smell of pine and cold air. He stood there for a long time, until his legs began to ache and the light turned gray again. Somewhere far above, a single crow called once, the sound sharp and lonely. Andre looked toward the direction the moose had gone, then back toward the open field. He felt neither fear nor confusion now, only a deep, quiet understanding that some things could move through the world without leaving any trace at all. When spring finally came, it did not arrive with warmth, but with sound. The frozen river began to groan beneath its crust, the snow sagged into rivulets, and the birch branches dripped steadily in the midday light. The white fields that had once held their stillness now melted into patches of dark soil and shallow pools. The world that had been locked and silent began to breathe again. Andre watched it from his porch each morning, his coat unbuttoned, a mug of tea cooling in his hands. The moose had not returned. He told himself it didn't matter, yet he found his eyes drawn again and again to the line of trees at the edge of the field. Even when the snow was gone, he thought he saw movement there sometimes. The shift of a shadow, the slow rise of something massive just beyond sight. He began to walk again, not to search, but simply to move. Every day he took the path across the softening ground, through the thawing birches, to the place where the snow had once swallowed all tracks. There was mud there now, water collecting in small hollows, the earth dark and raw. He would stand for a while, breathe the damp air, and listen. The forest made new noises now, dripping, cracking, the rustle of small things waking. Yet beneath it all there was still that same familiar silence, patient and steady, as though waiting for something that might never come again. The villagers spoke of other things, the floods, the planting, the road repairs, and no one mentioned the moose anymore. Lita said she hadn't seen it that year, and maybe that meant it had finally gone north, following the rivers. Andre only nodded. He did not argue. He had stopped trying to explain what he had seen, because words could not hold it. What stayed with him was not the image of the animal itself, but the stillness that had surrounded it. The deep, complete quiet in which everything else had briefly disappeared. Years passed. His hair turned white, his hands grew slower. The rifle above his door gathered dust, the scope fogged with age. Each winter he would look to the field again, though he no longer had the strength to cross it. When the frost came, he would sit by the window, tracing the same pale horizon with his eyes, remembering the morning when the world had seemed to stop breathing for the space of a heartbeat. One afternoon near the end of his life, a young boy from the village came to bring him firewood. The boy found Andre sitting outside, wrapped in a blanket, staring across the melting snow. "Grandpa Andre," the boy said, shy but curious, "is it true you once saw the great moose that left no footprints?" Andre smiled faintly, his eyes still on the field. "Maybe I did," he said after a long pause. "Or maybe it was just the winter itself, walking through." The boy frowned, not understanding, and turned to look. The birches stood silent in the weak light, their shadows long on the wet ground. There was nothing there, only the open land, the slow wind, the quiet trickle of water under the ice. But as the boy stood listening, he thought he heard something, a deep, distant rhythm, soft as breathing. It came from far away, from the place where the forest began. He looked harder, and for an instant he saw a dark shape moving between the trees, large and steady, disappearing as the light shifted. When he turned back, Andre's eyes were closed, his face calm, as if he had simply followed the silence at last. The boy waited, unsure, until the wind rose again, carrying the faint scent of pine across the thawing field. He looked once more at the trees, but there were no tracks, no sign of anything at all. Only the slow sound of water and the vast, eternal quiet that comes after something sacred has passed.